Well, while I was interested in studying psilocybin, research with this whole class of compounds had been blocked for decades.
Because he's talking about that the risks outweighed the benefits, so that's why they were stopped. And I think that you and I know that it has something much more to do with the forces that be, and really not wanting people to understand their true innate power within, and to keep them in the matrix of this third dimensional reality. So
we've known this all along, but science is catching up now, and they're starting to do the research to verify some of the things that the ancients have been saying for thousands of years. So it's kind of interesting. It took us a little time to get there, but I'm so happy that we are, because I think it's going to relieve a huge amount of suffering now that the scientific community is on board.
welcome to another edition of Psychedelic Sages, where we provide intuitive insights, truth bust, and service watchdogs and guides for topics around spiritual medicines, more commonly referred to as psychedelics. Welcome everyone to another edition of Psychedelic Sages. I'm Beth Bell.
I'm Stephanie Saul.
And today we thought we'd bring you some in-depth information on psilocybin mushrooms. So a little bit different format, where we're going to go into a little bit of a deep dive, looking at some of the research and some of the science behind magic mushrooms, also known as psilocybin. All right, Steph, well, we found a great little clip that I think gives, from a more medical perspective, some insights regarding psilocybin mushrooms. So let's start with that, and we'll look, just a little bit into what he's got to say, and then we'll give a deeper dive into some other things about psilocybin specifically.
Great.
So like trying to mix oil and water. Most people assume that science and spirituality don't play well together, but it's not true. Einstein said that the most beautiful and profound emotion we can experience is the sensation of the mystical. He said it's the source of all true science. Today, I want to tell you about research with the classic psychedelic psilocybin that's showing that under supported conditions, psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences associated with enduring positive changes in attitudes, mood, behavior. The results are fascinating in their own right, have implications for medical therapeutics, and implications as well for the nature of consciousness and ethics and altruism. So by way of background, I've been conducting research on mood-altering drugs for the past 40 years. About 20 years ago, I started a meditation practice that profoundly shifted my worldview and got me very curious about the nature of spiritual experience. I became reacquainted with research conducted mostly in the 1950s and 60s, showing that under some conditions, classic hallucinogens like psilocybin could occasion mystical experiences that look very much like those that occur naturally and that have been reported by mystics throughout the ages.
So he's scientific. I love that, right? He's coming from a scientific background. He's basically posing like the science and spirituality have to be so separate. A lot of people see it that way. Either you're very scientific and you're data driven, or you're mystical and more spiritual. And you and I know that it is so closely linked, and that science and spirituality go together hand in hand. So I love that he starts out this presentation talking about that.
Yes, it's funny. It's like spirituality, as we've known this all along, but science is catching up now, and they're starting to do the research to verify some of the things that the ancients have been saying for thousands of years. So it's kind of interesting. It took us a little time to get there, but I'm so happy that we are, because I think it's going to relieve a huge amount of suffering now that the scientific community is on board.
Let's keep listening.
I became interested in psilocybin. Psilocybin is the principal psychoactive component of the Psilocybe genus of mushroom. Psilocybin in the form of these mushrooms have been used for hundreds, possibly thousands of years within various cultures for healing and spiritual purposes. Well, while I was interested in studying psilocybin, research with this whole class of compounds had been blocked for decades because the risks, which are real, but they're manageable, were thought to totally outweigh the benefits.
So I wanted to just stop for a minute because he's talking about that the risks outweighed the benefits, so that's why they were stopped. And I think that you and I know that it has something much more to do with the forces that be, and really not wanting people to understand their true innate power within, and to keep them in the matrix of this third dimensional reality. So yeah, it's interesting that, of course, he's going to come at it from that perspective, because I think that's how most people see it, that it got blocked. But it's sort of like the deeper, why did it get blocked?
Well, it's probably because of the pharmaceutical companies. It's more commercially viable to just be on medication for the rest of your life for depression or addiction of some sort, and there's no cure. But with the psilocybin, there is a cure, and sometimes it's instantaneous, and there's no follow-on necessary because you have this awakening into what the deeper issues are that are going on within your own self that are causing you to constantly need whatever substance this is on a regular basis. And scientifically, they've even proven that this is one-stop shopping. A lot of times the person comes out and they don't need any more medication. So that's a cure. And
Yeah.
we haven't been in a cure-based society in quite a long time. So there is a scientific mind shift that's going on here that I think is really, again, extremely positive.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I think that the pharmaceutical companies have something to do with it, but I'm also an advocate in many ways of the pharmaceutical companies, because I think that they do bring good things for people. But in this case, I agree with you in that they are they have blocked it because of you can't make money off of it. You can't patent it, right? You can't patent Mother Nature. I mean, a lot of people are trying to do that now. But I think, even like another level up in consciousness, it's a whole nother level of energy and duality of these two realms that are working and playing off of one another. And I think it's really kind of pushed and shoved, and now we're starting to see more of the lighter forces coming in strength, whereas those darker forces that came through the pharmaceutical companies, that came through different political leaders. So it's interesting to kind of watch it as we do from like this higher realm, because we can see how the energies are at play and how they come into these different entities of companies or people or politicians. And so yeah, it's fun to watch.
It's amazing. We're in a psychedelic psilocybin renaissance
Yes.
time, and it's enlightening. And it's good to see the openness, at
Yeah.
least they're willing to look at the benefits for
Yeah.
humanity. And I think that's a huge shift in thinking as far as in the socio-political and pharmaceutical realms.
Yeah. I agree. All right. Well, let's hear what else he's got to say.
So it seemed like a long shot at the time, but my colleagues and I sought and ultimately obtained approval to administer psilocybin to healthy volunteers who had never before had an experience with this class of drugs. And as I'll show you, the results were life-changing for many of those participants and turned out to be career-changing for me, because psilocybin has become one principal focus of my research program. So what I want to do today is tell you about the Johns Hopkins Psilocybin Research Project. It's in its 15th year. We've given psilocybin to over about 250 volunteers, over 600 sessions. I'm going to tell you about psilocybin studies in healthy volunteers, in cancer patients, smokers, long-term meditators, and end with some conclusions. So we've conducted 3 rigorous double-blind studies in healthy volunteers. We've looked at dose effects. We've added controls for expectancy kinds of things. These sessions for these studies are held in a living room-like environment. Before the first session, volunteers develop a trusting relationship with our session monitors, which reduces adverse effects of psilocybin. On session days, volunteers come in, they swallow a capsule. They're encouraged to lay on a couch, use eye mask and headphones through which they listen to a musical program and direct their attention inward. If fear or anxiety arise, then the monitors are there to provide reassurance.
So I love how they're approaching. I mean, this is John Hopkins, right? This is an actual clinical trial. It's gone on for 15 years. I love that they're providing that living room feel. And one of the most important things they said was that they build the trust with the facilitators prior to the session, right? Because that makes all the difference. And I kind of get a like when he talks about like the adverse reactions, it's like there really is no adverse reactions. It's just that challenge of getting through the mind that doesn't want to let go, right? So even in that, it's not really an adverse reaction, but I understand from a clinical trial perspective, that's what they have to say.
Oh my gosh, this makes me so happy that they're really following the ancient protocol
Yeah.
of setting up the right environment with the right facilitators is really, really important. But it tickled me that you had to swallow a capsule. I would have really liked if they had done it the old-fashioned way and just had the actual mushroom itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
But other than that, I'm still happy that at least they're following the right protocol, because the environment and the other thing is the environment, as we know, Beth, is so important, but the fact that they're using music,
Yeah.
because the mushroom loves the music, and that follows the way of the shaman,
Yeah.
because they always had music accompanying the mushrooms.
Yeah, the other thing I'd be interested to know, which I don't think that they're doing, is really clearing the space energetically, saging it or just doing something to really clean it and clear it from other energies and entities. But look, I mean, what they're doing is certainly right up there with what can be clinically viable and also repeatable. So that's the other thing in clinical trials, is that it has to be a protocol that can be repeated, and a lot of people don't know how to clear energies. But the other thing I wanted to comment on, when you're talking about to pop the pill and we wish that they could just take the psilocybin. I mean, one of the challenges with Mother Nature, in a sense, is that each mushroom has a different strength of psilocybin. And so that's where I think pharmaceutical companies can come into play, and synthesized medications can come into play, because that's where you can get a consistent dose. So in a clinical trial, we need to know exactly how much psilocybin is someone getting, so that we can make comparisons to placebos. Yeah, well, it would be better if they could just have the mushrooms. We wouldn't actually know their dose. So I guess in defense of clinical trials and pharmaceutical companies, that's important. But let's
I
do this.
know, but I'm going to have to disagree with you there, because I know they can do it with cannabis, and they're doing it with different types of strain. It just takes some scientific maneuvering as well, because same thing with cannabis. We didn't know which strains did what, but I think we're getting there. And I just think this is a step in the right direction. I
Yeah.
really,
Yeah, you mean that the companies are looking at how much is in the actual mushrooms? Because I'm not saying that you can't take natural
yeah.
mushrooms, but I'm saying you have to know how much psilocybin is in the dosage that you're giving of natural mushrooms versus a pill, which is something that's synthesized, is just a little bit easier to know exactly what
Yeah,
that.
but it's the same way with cannabis. They didn't know how much THC was in there,
Yeah,
but now they do. Now they know how to grow the THC to match, I guess the regulatory environment. But I think it's coming. I think it's
yeah,
coming. And I just wanted to mention that I do think eventually they will know how much psilocybin is in this particular strain and be able to grow that particular
yeah,
strain with that particular amount of.
yeah, yeah, yep. Great point.
So, not surprisingly, a high dose of psilocybin under these conditions produces hallucinogen-like effects. So there are perceptual changes like visual illusions. There's greater emotionality, like increased sense of joy, less frequently fear. And there are cognitive changes. But to me, the most interesting effect was that in most volunteers studied, psilocybin produced great increases in questionnaires that had been specifically designed to measure naturally occurring mystical experiences. These experiences are characterized by a sense of unity, a feeling that all people and things are connected, accompanied by a sense of sacredness, a sense of positive mood, love, joy, and a deeply felt sense of encountering ultimate reality. These experiences are felt to be more real and more true than everyday waking consciousness. Now, psilocybin is a relatively short-acting drug, so by the end of the session day, these effects are gone, but vivid memories for these salient experiences endure.
I think it's great how he he talks about how quickly it can be out of the system, but the vivid memories remain. And I think that's the integration work that is necessary afterwards, because if we're not reflecting about the messages that we received, sometimes they can be fleeting memories. I mean, even some of our most important memories, are ingrained in us, but we don't necessarily continue to learn the lessons from them if we're not aware and intentional about how we integrate them into our everyday life.
Yes, because usually the messages are profound. What you're able to see within yourself, within your experience. I don't think you ever really forget those things. But again, I think it does continue over a period of certain weeks, say 6 weeks after, you still are getting information about your journey,
Yeah.
what you observed, what you felt, what you know, what you sense and feel. So that's why, again, to me the integration process is really important afterwards, but again the memories just continue of the experience. So again, that's why integration is important.
Yeah.
In one study, we had volunteers return a month after each session to complete some questionnaires. 80% of the volunteers in that study, after having 1 or 2 high doses of psilocybin, reported that the experience was among the 5 most personally meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their lives. And in fact, about 50% said it was the single most personally and spiritually significant experience of their life, comparing it, for instance, to the birth of a firstborn child or death of a parent. These are stunning and remarkable findings. Long-term follow-up of these kinds of effects shows that they're sustained, these positive effects are sustained for at least a year and probably longer. And it wasn't just the volunteers who reported these effects. We did structured interviews with friends, family members, and colleagues at work. And this statistically verified the volunteers' reports. So we've continued this whole line of research over the last several years and studied other populations, the first of which are psychologically distressed cancer patients.
Okay, I love what he has to say, but I thought that before we would get into some of the clinical data that he's talking about, which may be an entirely different video to talk about the John Hopkins and other studies that are ongoing, that we talk a little bit more about how it's actually impacting the brain from a scientific standpoint. So there's another video I thought we'd take a look at.
Excellent.
This is the map of a typical human brain, and this is the map of a brain on psilocybin, the psychoactive compound in magic mushrooms. All those new connections you can see don't just make people trip. They're also the reason that psilocybin is one of today's most talked about drugs in certain medical circles. Worldwide, more than 180 species of mushrooms produce psilocybin, likely as a defense strategy. Scientists believe that psilocybin may dampen the appetite of predatory insects like ants, so that they feel full long before eating their way through the entire mushroom. Humans, on the other hand, well, they trip.
Psilocybin is a so-called classic psychedelic, so it's in the same category as drugs like LSD and works in the brain in basically the same way.
When you take psilocybin, your gut converts it into another chemical known as psilocin, which binds to serotonin receptors called 2A. And experts think that's what triggers what they call neuronal avalanching. It's essentially a domino effect of different changes in the brain. You've got increased activity in the visual cortex, which leads to changes in your perception, and then decreased network activity in the default mode network, which leads to a loss of ego.
And that may be why people often report at high doses a profound sense of unity, transcending beyond themselves.
But perhaps most importantly, psilocybin increases connectivity among different regions of the brain.
Because of that receptor activation, there is a profound change in the way that different areas of the brain synchronize with each other.
Think of it like an orchestra. Normally, the brain has different musical groups that each play independently.
A sextet there, here's a quartet there, this one's playing jazz, this one's classical, and a number of other ones.
But once psilocybin enters, it's like you suddenly have a conductor.
So there is this communication between areas that are normally kind of compartmentalized and doing their own thing.
Scientists believe that it's a combination of these effects that makes psilocybin so useful for combating depression and addiction.
I love that we get into the science aspect of this and the neuroplasticity. And I also really like how they talk about it as an orchestra and how psilocybin comes in as more of the conductor and how compartmentalized. I mean, I think we're very familiar and people are familiar with the default mode network now in their brain, and quieting that down, which also helps the ego mind to quiet so that your brain can be more open and can communicate across the superhighways, kind of like the mycelium network that's happening underground with fungi, right? Where they're actually communicating to each other. It sort of connects us into this superhighway of consciousness.
I love it. It's just biohacking at its best.
Yeah.
Really being able to rewire your whole brain function.
Yeah.
That is massive. And I think for creativity, for healing, for grounding yourself, for quieting your mind, for relationship enhancement, it's just a miracle drug. It really is magic.
Yeah, it is. And it's Mother Nature. It's all natural. So I know that we're going to talk more and more through a series of videos about the different companies that are studying psilocybin. But I think what's going to be fascinating is when you take the actual mushroom itself, you get sort of the full spectrum benefits, whereas a lot of the companies are trying to take out certain aspects, which can be good because it'll be very targeted for different conditions. But here we're going to stay focused on the holistic, full spectrum benefits of the psilocybin mushroom, and we'll break it up in many, many videos to come.
Absolutely.
When new areas in the brain start talking to each other, for example, you might have new insights into old problems. And that's why some experts describe tripping as a condensed version of talk therapy. And then dissolving your ego, Johnson says,
can be profoundly healing.
And there's actually an increasing amount of research to prove it. In 2 studies published in 2016, researchers gave cancer patients with depression a large dose of psilocybin. And even 6 months later, at least 80% of them showed significant decreases in depressed mood. And research on addiction is equally promising. In a study led by Johnson, 15 volunteers took psilocybin to quit smoking. And after 6 months, 80% of them had kicked the habit, compared to a rate of about 35% for the drug varenicline, which is widely considered the best smoking cessation drug out there. Yet despite these results, psilocybin is still listed as a Schedule I drug, a category reserved for compounds that have no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Now, taking magic mushrooms recreationally does come with some risks.
So, a dramatic example would be driving under the influence of psilocybin, or using it in a way that interferes with your job or your family relations or your schoolwork, for example.
But as far as scientists know, long-term use doesn't damage the brain in the way that other drugs can. And according to at least one study, it's actually the safest drug out there. In 2018, for example, just 0.3% of people who reported taking them needed medical emergency treatment, compared to 0.9% for ecstasy and 1.3% for alcohol. Taken all together, that's why some states across the country have campaigned to decriminalize psilocybin, including Denver, which in May of 2019 became the first ever to succeed.
Interesting. I mean, 2019, we've already had a state decriminalize magic mushrooms. I believe you can go and actually buy them quite easily. And Oregon, of course, has followed. And I think there's several other states that now have it actually legalized. So, but it's fascinating the clinical studies that he started to talk about, and that we'll get more into again with the TED Med talk. And we'll be able to see, what's happening with that Johns Hopkins study that's actually led to getting the FDA on board to fast track some of these psychedelic medicines to help us with mental health and anxiety and depression.
is really exciting. You know, we're finally getting to where Europe has been, well, like Holland has been for years. We're finally catching up. And I commend the state of Colorado for being a pioneer in legislation as far as psilocybin is concerned. And hopefully many other states will follow, including our home state of California. Hopefully. But it's so exciting. Again, this is a psilocybin renaissance. I think this is where we need to be. We need healing. We need cures, and there are so many that are provided by Mother Nature. And I'm so thrilled that we're finally taking advantage of the wonderful benefits of brain freedom, brain enhancement.
Well, brain communication, right? I mean, to
Yes.
increase your neuroplasticity, I mean, we know that as we go from toddlers to teenagers to young adults to, you know, our midlife, that we start to get ingrained in our beliefs and our ideas about how the world works and how we observe and how we create our environment, and our environment continues to help create us. It's sort of that vicious cycle. So when we can expand our consciousness and allow our neural networks to actually communicate and reconnect with themselves, you know, in our brain chemistry, yeah, it opens us to a whole other realms and worlds that we're really excited to talk about, because that really gets us into more of, you know, oneness, the Godhead. All of that is sort of the place that everyone wants to go, but there's a lot of great work that can be done everywhere in between. And so there's so much that can happen with psilocybin and nature's medicine, and I'm just excited to see where this is.
But it's utopia in the making. It's amazing. Can you imagine an addiction-free, depression-free society? Just those two things?
Yeah.
It's an incredible human breakthrough.
It is.
So,
and in future videos, I do want us to talk about cases where individuals may abuse some of these spiritual medicines. So there is, I think, some cautionary tales. I think both of us believe that we're not here to say that everyone should be taking psilocybin or that everyone should be partaking in spiritual medicines. It's something that you do feel called to do. And so we'll talk about some of that in future videos, but it is nature's magic. And by all means, I think it's something that if you feel called to do, find the right set and setting, the right practitioner. Yeah, and there'll be lots of benefits that come from it.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, there's always abuse, but I do think I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. I just think that, yes, there could be abuse, but then I think the benefits outweigh the potentials of some of those negative things that can possibly happen.
Yeah.
I'm going to stay optimistic about that.
Yeah. Yes, I am too. All right. Well, tune in for more videos and to learn more of our deep dive into the psilocybin mushrooms. So there's another video I found that I thought would be worthwhile to at least put up, because I like how he talks about the receptor sites in a little bit more detail. You know, granted, this guy may not be the high science background, but he still has some good things to say.
Hey there guys, I'm Jesse Crow, the traveling scientist. And today I want to talk all about magic mushrooms, answering 3 key questions. How do they act in the body? Are they safe to use? And what to do if you have too many magic mushrooms? Magic mushrooms grow in the ground and they contain a chemical called psilocybin. Upon ingestion, this chemical is metabolized into psilocin, which then moves into the bloodstream. And psilocin is structurally similar to serotonin. So it binds to the serotonin receptors in your brain and has 2 main effects. 1, it stops serotonin from being taken back up into your nerves, increasing the serotonin effect. And 2, it also binds to the serotonin receptors to amplify those feelings of euphoria. About 30 minutes after taking magic mushrooms, you'll start to feel euphoric, delusional, and you might even start to hallucinate. This is because psilocin causes your brain to temporarily rearrange its neural networks. And as chemical messages pass through these new and undefined pathways, you'll start to experience really vivid and unusual new perspectives of your environment. And this is going to last for 3 to 6 hours, depending on how much psilocybin you actually consumed. If you consume too much psilocybin, you'll start to experience some negative effects. You'll be restless, uncoordinated, anxious, and you might even freak out. This is known as a bad trip, man. Luckily, it's almost impossible to overdose on magic mushrooms. Theoretically, you would need to consume 19 grams of pure psilocybin. Although it varies, mushrooms are usually about 1% psilocybin by weight. So that means you would need to consume 1.9 kilograms worth of magic mushrooms. That's like an insane amount of mushrooms. Just don't eat that many. Don't do it.
I love how he graphically depicts serotonin and how similar it is to psilocybin and what it does to the receptors. So he gives a little bit more insight as to how we get that communication happening, the brain chemistry happening for the neuroplasticity.
No, I really like this guy. I really, I love the way he shows what it would really take to OD on mushrooms.
Yeah.
The amount you would absolutely have to consume. I think that's really an important point, that it would be really, really difficult for you to just continuously sit there and do it. Because, you know, sometimes less is more to get the proper experience you need. And if you can just get less with all those neural networks going and communicating with each other, why would you want to even do more?
Well, and I think the other point that we've made is it's all about set and setting. So if you're going to, you're not, the danger isn't in the overdose of the actual mushrooms. The danger is in your environment. And, you know, if you're going to walk out in front of a train because you have no, you know, you're not in your consciousness here on the earth plane. It's an inward journey. I know a lot of people have used it as recreational. They've used it for dancing and having a good time. But the inward journey is where a lot of the real lessons come in. And so, yeah, I think it's great that he makes the point that, you know, you're not really going to overdose on mushrooms, but you could put yourself in a situation where you don't know your surroundings and your environment, which just speaks to having the right people around you in the right set and setting.
Absolutely. The set and setting, I think, as we've in our videos, we've emphasized tremendously important to have the right people, setting, environment is key, no matter what kind of psychedelic you're taking, in order to get the best out of Mother's Nature's magic.
Yes.
So absolutely.
Well, let's take a listen. I think he's got a few more things to say. I'm not sure.
Why would you eat that many mushrooms? The biggest danger when using magic mushrooms is getting the wrong kind of mushroom. See, in the wild, magic mushrooms are easily mistaken for other types of mushrooms that might be non-edible or might even be poisonous. This also means that you could mistake normal mushrooms for magic mushrooms. Imagine if you were cooking a meal for your friends and you wanted some fresh mushrooms and you accidentally used magic mushrooms instead. That would be a crazy evening, so don't go out and just pick random mushrooms. Don't do it. The most toxic mushroom is called Amanita phalloides, and I think I pronounced that right. But I know that it causes 95% of death by mushroom poisoning. Eating them leads to hypoglycemia and organ failure, so don't eat them. Another thing to consider is that magic mushrooms show a wide variety in potency. One mushroom might contain only a minuscule amount of psilocybin, while the next mushroom can contain 2 or 3 times as much of the same chemical. So that's something important to keep in mind. If someone's had too many magic mushrooms, they might feel nauseous, anxious, paranoid, agitated, even psychotic. Knowing the mushroom species can be really helpful. If you're not a mycologist and you can't work out what species of mushroom it is, it's best just to treat the symptoms. It's really important to talk to them, try and calm them down, take them to a quiet place and offer them mental support.
So I think it's interesting that he's also talking about the types of mushrooms and that there are some lethal mushrooms out there. So it speaks to, don't just go out and try to get your own mushrooms. Don't just take them from a friend. Don't just take them, you know, from someone randomly. Don't take them at a party, right? Know who is supplying you with what, because that's again where the trouble can come in. Is even if with some of the other drugs that are out there, they're laced with other things. So it's important that you're getting it from a real viable source, which is why I also really like that Oregon and some of these states have legalized it, because then there still is some you know, parameters around the quality and the efficacy of what it is, and that it's not poisonous.
Exactly. You can't go and forage. This is not a foraging exercise because of the lethal mushrooms that are readily available. But again, it's all about knowing your supplier, your environment, so important, and the source is really, really important. And hopefully we'll have many other states that'll be just like Colorado, that'll regulate, and Oregon, that'll regulate us so that we can have a safe offering in here in California too.
Yeah.
And for more information, check out tripsafe.org. It's a really great website that offers a lot of information about hallucinogens like magic mushrooms. Anyway, that's all for today, guys. Thanks so much for watching.
I like the fact that he's given information, like what happens in a bad trip and what you can do about it. I think that's really important.
So now we'll toggle back over to the TED MD talk and hear a little bit more from him. Thanks for tuning into this episode. If you like what you hear, please give us a thumbs up below and hit the bell and be the first to receive updates. Visit our Patreon site, Psychedelic Sages, for more in-depth information.